my name is Angelina Giordano. I'm a project officer with the Green Municipal Fund, and I want to welcome you today to our Exploring How to Integrate Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion into Municipal Climate Action webinar. This webinar is to support the launch of the Partners for Climate Protection program resource, exploring how to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion into municipal climate action. We have two facilitators today, myself and my colleague, Anahi Reyes. And then we have two presentations presented by the PCP Fellows, Pacifique Bergermana and Nikasha Tengrahala, followed by a panel discussion with Pacifique and Nikasha, who will be joined by Ty Smith, Megan Meany, and Devin Cosley. So without further ado, we will get started. Next slide, please. So a bit of housekeeping, because we will have one presentation that is done in English and one presentation that is done in French, I recommend that unless you're fully bilingual, you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on the globe icon with the interpretation underneath the globe. And then you can select the language of your choice, either English to hear all of the presenters speak in English, or French to hear all of the presenters in French. Si vous souhaitez écouter en français.
So if you wish to listen in French, please click on the globe at the bottom of your screen. Whatever the language, you will be able to keep on listening in French or in English according to your preference.
Next slide, please. So for the agenda, first we have introductions and a land acknowledgement, then the engagement agreements, learning objectives, the research results, because prior to the development of the Integrating Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion into Climate Action resource, the PCP Fellows conducted research to determine what knowledge product was appropriate to develop. Then we have the implementation and review process of the external resource that we're presenting today, key highlights from the resource, a 20-minute facilitated discussion, and next steps for PCP and the organizations involved in creating this resource. And in closing, we'll have a poll to see how we did today. Next slide, please. So it's really important, especially given the context of this webinar, to acknowledge the land where we're coming from. Given our context in environmental work, I want you all to take a minute to reflect with me and put in the chat where you're joining from today to recognize the culture and the history of these lands. So currently, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land from which I'm meeting you. Today, I acknowledge the indigenous lands of the traditional territory of both the Kanakahake and the Anishinaabe peoples. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to live here, and I thank the many generations who have taken care of this land and these waters. Teokahake Memorial is historically known as a gathering place for diverse First Nations. Thus, we recognize and deeply appreciate the historic and ongoing Indigenous connections to and presence on these lands and waters. So please take a moment to reflect on this with me and put it on the chat, as this is one of the first steps for reconciliation. Next slide, please. So before getting into the resource, I wanted to give a bit of context about the program. The Partners for Climate Protection program is a network of over 500 municipalities across Canada from coast to coast to coast who have committed to taking action on climate change. And they do this by going through a 5-milestone framework, developing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, setting an emissions reduction target, creating a climate action plan, implementing the plan, and the monitoring and evaluation. And throughout the presentations, we'll be discussing how the different concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion are incorporated into the Partners for Climate Protection program. Next slide, please. So I wanted to define the learning objectives for today. First, we want to define equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are many different definitions out there. So the PCP program, with the help of our fellows, came up with some definitions that we're using for the purposes of our resource. We're going to understand a bit better how equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations fit into municipal climate action. We're going to identify how to apply these concepts into your work within the context of the PCP milestone framework. We'll learn a bit about how to collaborate more with vulnerable members of the community and how to overcome some common challenges and concerns that we gathered through the research were apparent among municipal staff. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Anahi Reyes.
Thank you, Angelina. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anahi Reyes, and I'm very grateful to be here with you today, together with Angelina and with our two fellows. It's a really proud moment for us to present at the end of this research project with you. We recognize that this is a very large group, and with large groups and big presentations, we wanted to put together moments of listening and learning, as well as opportunities to share and collaborate in smaller discussions. Meeting virtually is challenging for many reasons, and so today we're proposing the following engagement agreements that will help us build an environment of respect and collaboration. We ask that everyone who chooses to attend this session today agrees to uphold these behaviors throughout the duration of this session. So I would ask that you take a moment to please read these statements and give us an agreement button in the chat, or you can react with a thumbs up, just in case anybody does not agree to adopt these behaviors today. As you can see, the behaviors are quite simple, but they have a big impact. I'd like to call your attention specifically to allowing us to hear one voice at a time. So if you have questions, please use the chat or the Q&A box to submit them, so that we are allowing our presenters enough time and respect to deliver their content. We will strive to stick to the agenda and the schedule to the best of our abilities. We are trying to speak to each other and not to a room during our discussion. And if ideas are to be challenged, we encourage you to challenge the concepts themselves and not the people proposing them. We agree to be mindful of all opportunities for voices to be heard. If you feel like a voice is not heard, we will step up or step back to allow that. And finally, we ask that you avoid multitasking during this session, lest you miss some important concepts or interrupt presenters' presentation. To avoid electronics unrelated to the session would also be recommended. Thank you, everybody, for agreeing to respect these engagements today. As a little bit of background, we wanted to present to you what over a year ago the PCP Secretariat and leadership ventured into trying to answer. And it was a question that had been brought up by you, the members of the PCP network, multiple times before. And that question was, how can we integrate equity considerations into municipal climate action? We knew that our internal team did not have the full capacity to give this project appropriate resourcing, and we did not have the in-house expertise to answer this question confidently. So we chose to bring in two research fellows, Natasha, who comes to us from the EDI background as a PhD candidate, and Pacifique, who comes to us from the Environmental Studies branch, also at a university in Montreal. The perfect intersection of these two fellows and their lived experiences could help us conduct initial research within the PCP network, so that we could identify the most relevant challenges that you, the members of the PCP network, are facing. What we found was great interest in your part, the members of the PCP program, to share your challenges and contribute to the project. And we are very grateful to you. Thank you again to everyone who participated in that research in multiple forms as it came. Aside from the findings of within the network, this guide encompasses the academic and lived experiences of both our fellows, feedback from our PCP partners inside and outside of our two managing organizations, and a professional content review, actually several runs of professional content review. Our first and arguably the most important finding was that our initial scope was far too great. We were aiming a little bit too high and too wide to bring you a guide that contained content that perhaps the network wasn't ready to receive. There was a very clear need for taking a step back and establishing a good foundation first, onto which we could build upon in the future. And so the research in the final resource became an introductory guide where we find commonality in our collective challenges. We define the concepts, define the concepts that will pave the way for us to continue setting up action. And we set you up to look ahead with confidence. So after refining the scope of work, we handed it over to our fellows, and I would like to introduce them to you now. Pacifique Vigirimana is a student of the Master's Program in Environmental and Sustainable Development, Social Issues and Governance at the Faculty of Art and Science de l'Université de Montréal. And together with Nakasha Tangirala, PhD candidate of Educational Studies in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education, DISE at McGill University, conducted multiple rounds of research, literature reviews, and several other activities that ended up in the creation of a research findings report and a public-facing guide, which we will present to you in a bit more. At this time, I would like to hand over the mic to Pacifique so that she can take us through the highlights of the research endeavor. If you are listening in English, this next portion of the presentation will be in French, so I recommend choosing your preferred language at this time. Pacifique, over to you.
Merci, Anaï.
Thank you, Anaï. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pacifique Bigirimana. I do live in the city of Regina in Saskatchewan. I just finished my master's degree in environment and sustainable development at the University of Montreal with a specialization of honors in social and governance challenges. My professional experience, well, I'm in the field of the community development, accompaniment services, focusing on entrepreneurship and project planning and management. So it's an honor for me to be with you to talk about the pathway of our data collection within a project started by the PCP program in order to develop operationalization tools of the EDI principle within the municipal climate action. I would like to talk about the progression and the outcome obtained from September to December 2021. So before getting to the heart of the matter, I would like to highlight, first of all, that the land on which I am based are part of the Treaty 4 territories, where the Cris, Saltos, Dakotas, and Nakotas, as well as Dakotas come from, as well as the Métis. So our research goal was to find scientific documentation and reports, as well as guides and Canadian articles dealing with equity, diversity, inclusion, and climate justice challenges. We wanted to gather the current resources recommended by subject matter practitioners. We also wanted to ask directly to the municipalities why this subject is so relevant and so important for them, and what prevents them from moving forward. How could our program help them out? We also had to find examples of concerns relating to EDI that would also apply to climate change. So next, please.
Notre approche méthodologique a été faite
So
en 4
our
étapes. Il y a d'abord
approach
l'analyse
was
documentaire
made
qui a
in
mis
3
le doigt
different
sur les
steps.
terminologies
First of all,
et les
the
terminologies
documentary analysis
vont nous aider à mieux cerner
that
les
and the
enjeux
terminology that will help
et
us better
adapter
understand or identify
les diverses
challenges and
actions
the
climatiques.
practices
Pour
to
inclure aussi les
operationalize
parties prenantes
and integrate EDI principle in the climate
un
actions.
sondage
We
en ligne
also organized an online survey, an in-house consultation table, individual interviews, and also group focus. So we wanted to know what were the participants to all those different steps. So we had the participation of the FCM staff members to an in-house consultation table and individual interviews. The online survey was filled by over 107 municipalities. Two focus groups were organized, one with the municipalities and another one with different organizations working in environmental protection. So the different questions were asked are as follows. So two key questions. Are you informed of the EDI principle? And second question, when you combine all those ideas, what are the practices and management tools that you have already used so to check what is already being experimented within different municipalities? So we had actually very good outcomes. So to summarize, we can say that the analysis of the literature provided us some theories, approaches. Can you move the slide forward, please? So we had the approaches, tools, and theories that work to integrate the EDI principles. In other words, the categories of vulnerabilities that we have to take into account in the context of fight against climate change. Everyone knows that vulnerabilities are really different. So as a definition of vulnerability, we can say that vulnerability refers to the predisposition of being affected in a negative fashion. And this makes reference to the features of the human system or socio-ecological system that are exposed to very dangerous climate change or events. We also were able to describe the distribution justice. We talked about the Rawlsian theory that proposed to repair and transform unfair inequalities by appropriate policies of redistribution of goods and compensation of financial transfer, social and economic helps. So, in other words, we also are waiting for positive or negative outcomes. So we were also able to collect different public things of community-based commitments. So the different and we also address our definition. So it's the same state of mind that we were able to find the use of different languages promoted a good collaboration with stakeholders and First Nation people. Next slide, please. So the analysis of information, well, we know that the municipalities try to improve the way the people are part of the climate change fight, and they do integrate EDI principle in their different climate change projects. We also notice some relevant concerns of the different stakeholders. So those provide us an idea as to the needs of municipalities in order for their climate actions to be fair. So, and I can talk about those concerns. So, for instance, we know that EDI is really important, but we don't know where to start with. Second concern, when EDI challenges are brought up, I don't feel prepared and it's too complex to face them. Another concern, we would like to incorporate the EDI, but what if we accidentally do the wrong thing? Another concern, we actually have an EDI plan, but I'm not sure whether it's really working properly. We all already have great strategies, but we want to have a common strategy. So as you can see, most of the respondents do know the principle of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Some have already actually adopted some strategies, but they notice that they are not really standardized. So we need not only standardization, but also regulation to operationalize the EDI principles. We also found out that the best approach to implement and integrate the EDI principle would be through the integration of current projects. In other words, that's what we call the PCP. So we could wonder, what are the climate actions and how can we conceive them and implement them? Usually climate actions are about policies and projects aimed at mitigating or adapting to climate change. Some researchers try to explain this. For instance, Dupuy and his cooperators stated that the mitigation policies aim at stabilizing or mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So regarding adaptation, we are talking about prevention, mitigation, or fair repartition measures of the negative issues, current or future of the climate change. So climate actions are projects or policies that try to bring positive changes in the way human beings have to behave in order to protect climate or adapt to climate change. So there are some different steps in a project implementation. Usually we have 5 different phases. The first one would be initialization or kickoff, and then the planning, third implementation, then the follow-up assessment, and then the end. So at each phases, we have different processes reflecting EDI principle. So the EDI principle takes into account all vulnerabilities. As I said, those do vary, so we have to take into account all of this. We also have to take into account all the stakeholders who actually set up working teams. They establish some goods and services distribution criteria, and also the decision-making processes, inclusive communication systems, or the sharing of environmental education and other programs of capacity building. So at different steps and different programs, we have to make sure that we really took into account the ADI principle. Another understanding, well, the terminology issues are very important for all climate action managers. We all have to have the same understanding of the definitions of concept. Sometimes we talk about equity, people don't know what it means, what we mean with equity or with diversion or inclusion. So all the managers of climate change must have the same understanding and vision of those concepts. So the state institutions and community-based organizations, but also university researchers have tried to define the words equity, inclusion, and diversity. They bring forward some clarification elements that go along the same line. So the municipalities do recognize the necessity to give a priority, or to prioritize rather, participative planning and adaptive management. So all stakeholders should be able to have their voice heard in the decision-making process. So in practice, the adaptive management is the most collaborative management mode that promotes the development of trust relationships between the different stakeholders. The involvement of local actors in the knowledge generation process and learning process makes the whole process legitimate. So it would be very easy to be part to the implementation of policy when we were part of the generation of the theory leading to this policy. So the adaptive management is an approach of management whereby the results are being followed, assessed, and quantified, usually through a scientific methodology. So different actors have been are being involved, including First Nations. So it's a process through which stakeholders are being valued. There is a power sharing between the government and the local resources users. We must also consult the public. This way, there is a trust relationship in the whole process. Also, formal partnership have to be set. So sustainable partnership that allow us to have a sustainable climate action. Actually, we collected a few practices that are working out. The first one, well, creating community profiles through the mapping technology. It's an opportunity to identify vulnerable people. What are the activities? So the mapping helps us create maps of the reality of climate needs, and we can inform political decisions and planning decisions. We also have to promote terminologies relating to EDI. So just to clarify the signification and practices and the different definition.
Comprennent des acteurs. Donc, il faut inclure tous les acteurs locaux, les organismes environnementaux, les instituts de recherche. Et donc, aussi, il faut tenir compte que la collaboration sera facilitée.
So we also have to take into account that the people are
très productifs. Donc, il faut aussi fixer des critères de sélection des bénéficiaires qui permettraient aux catégories de citoyens vulnérables de bénéficier ou accéder aux biens et services offerts par les actions climatiques. Ça, c'est aussi des pratiques qui aident à refléter EDI. Il faut aussi matérialiser une communication
We also
inclusive.
have to look at inclusive communication, so through channels where all stakeholders can then contribute with their feedback. In addition to that, we need visibility for diversity and look at climate action and to see how to improve the feeling of belonging. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pacifique. Congratulations for all of your work. You did great research.
Just to reiterate some of the lessons that we learned through the survey and the focus groups that Pacifique and Nakasha led, one of the main points is that we can never have all the answers. So Pacifique went over some strategies that you can possibly include. But with this kind of work, it's always a process of reworking and relearning and determining the best way forward because every community is different. We've also surfaced a need for more research and more resource development and more collaboration in this area. So this resource is very much a first step that municipalities can take and to get started with asking those key questions. So next slide, please. So when we went from the research process to the writing process, Nakasha and Pacifique determined that an external resource that defined the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion and laid out those common concerns that municipalities had and sort of came up with some solutions to address those common concerns. We realized that two fellows are not capable of including or representing the voices of everyone across Canada. So the process of reviewing the document was really important to ensure that we got as many perspectives as possible in the final product. That's why we worked with an external equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, Julie Savaria, to review the EDI principles. We also are very fortunate to have Ty Smith, the Senior Director of Anti-Racism and Inclusion at FCM, who did an internal review. And we also had Megan Meany from ICLEI Canada, the Executive Director, do the climate change context along with the team at ICLEI Canada. And we also had many internal reviews done by various FCM staff and individuals. Unfortunately, I don't have time to name all of the individuals that helped us, but we couldn't have done it without everyone who worked very hard on this resource. So I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge everyone. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nikasha Tangrahala, who was the lead author on the external resource, the Integrating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion into Municipal Climate Action resource. So Nikasha, if you'd like to present how to read the guide and some key findings and lessons learned.
All right. Hello. Thank you, Angelina, for that introduction, and Anahi for your introduction earlier. As they mentioned, my name is Nikasha Tangirala. I'm a PhD candidate currently, but I'm also a researcher, educator, and my background has a lot to do with EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, but more specifically anti-racism and anti-oppression education. So this slide here, this first part, is an overview of what the resource looks like. So a SparkNotes version, if you will, of the table of contents. And so for today's presentation, I'll touch upon some of the ideas in part 1, but really primarily I'm going to be focusing on part 3 of our resource. So lessons learned in implementing EDI in climate action. And so one last thing I would mention before I move on to that is just that if there is any part of this presentation, something I've spoken to or any of the others presenters have spoken to that you find is relevant to your work or sparks your particular interest, I really would encourage you, of course, to go and read the guide in detail, but also there's a wealth of additional resources that we've included within the guide itself. So if there is a particular area of interest, something you'd like to do a deeper dive on, chances are there's going to be a number of additional resources on that specific area as well. Next slide, please. So before I get started, I did want to read out to you some of these foundational definitions. I'm sure that you've heard the acronym EDI before, and you've probably heard definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion previously, but just so that we have some common definitions moving forward with this presentation. So equity refers to fairness and justice in policies, processes, and outcomes for historically and or currently underrepresented and or marginalized people and groups. It considers power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes altogether. And so there are some additional definitions of different types of equity that we should bear in mind in our climate action work or work in general. And for each of the terms within the resource, equity, diversity, and inclusion, there are additional key terminology that we should really bear in mind with our work. I didn't have time today to read you an exhaustive list and didn't think that would be interesting in a presentation format. But again, I would really encourage you to take a look at the resource itself and read some of those terms that fall under these categories that you may be unfamiliar with. Next slide, please. So then we have diversity, which simply refers to the presence of differences. However, when we're thinking about diversity in the context of EDI integration into our work, what we're really concerned about is not just the differences, but what do these differences mean for people and their lives? So the differences listed there are some of the dimensions that we might be considering, or some of the things that we might consider dimensions of difference, but of course this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are so many different kinds of differences that we have to be cognizant of, and the reality is we can't approach any communities, working with communities, any kind of project with an equity lens, if we don't first have an understanding of differences and what those differences mean in a real life way. Because if we don't understand those differences, then we're not able to use equity in order to serve those diverse communities. So really they go hand in hand, as do all three of these ideas. Next slide, please. So that brings us to inclusion, which is feeling welcome, belonging, with the capacity to engage and succeed in any given environment. And again, there are some additional definitions there just to give you a holistic idea of what inclusion looks like, but far more detail within the resource itself. And so the key here with these three foundational definitions, ideas, or approaches is that all three work together and they have a symbiotic relationship with one another. And in our EDI integration, we're really aiming for a balance of all three of these approaches. As you can tell with the definitions, there's a lot of overlap between these three ideas. They really can't be separated, and we can't impact positive changes or meaningful, equitable work without aiming for a balance of all three of these approaches. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the lessons learned in implementing EDI in climate action. So part 3 of our resource. And the lessons learned really is the bulk of our resource. And so with equity, diversity, and inclusion, how we framed it is that really the approach in combination is motivated by a regard for humanity and a commitment to social justice. And if we do achieve that balance in our work, and we're constantly striving to do so, it is more likely that we're also going to impact socially just outcomes. And so in terms of part 3, the lessons learned in implementing EDI, this is the bulk again of the resource, and we framed it via lessons learned for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I think that is really indicative of what happened. So section 3 is indicative of the lessons learned over the course of the process of putting together this guide, lessons learned through collaboration, through research, through the experience of others. So it's really reflective or a culmination of those lessons that we learned in different areas, as I think Pacifique and previous presenters have spoken to. But additionally, we felt it was important to frame this section as lessons learned because, as Angelina was mentioning, a key part of this resource is explaining how, laying out how, illustrating how EDI is really an iterative process. So there are no silver bullet solutions. And so by framing it via lessons learned, we thought that that went towards FCM and all of us acknowledging that we too were engaging with this iterative process that we had laid out, and that, you know, this resource is just one step towards EDI integration. Here are some of the lessons that we've learned so far, but by no means are we done in terms of our learning process, and that FCM has really committed to EDI integration and continued learning in the long term. So lesson 1, we entitled it Laying the Groundwork and Understanding Context. And so this is really imperative. It's vitally important as a first idea in terms of integrating EDI into climate action. And so when I say laying the groundwork and understanding context, what I mean by that is really understanding communities and the people with which we work. So what impact does our climate action work have on communities? And the reality is, I think we all know that climate change and issues of the environment have differential impacts across communities, and they really do tend to disproportionately and very negatively impact already marginalized communities. So in trying to understand ways in which to mitigate and hopefully eventually eradicate those disproportionate impacts, we really first need to have an understanding of who is it that we're working with, what do communities really need, and who are they? So here are some initial ideas taken from the guide of what laying the groundwork might look like. There are, of course, more examples within the resource, and there are real life examples of what some of these strategies might look like, but things like asking EDI evaluative questions, seeking to collaborate meaningfully with communities, asking communities for input on EDI plans and strategies directly. And then Pacifique spoke to this a little bit, but there is a lot of information and several resources we've included about what's called EDI mapping to get an idea of context for different demographics that you might be working with. And so there's a lot of real life examples and information about how that's been a helpful strategy in laying the groundwork in the guide. And so I think the thing with climate action work, or really any kind of work, for instance, with FCM, they work with such a diversity of municipalities, and then within each municipality, there are so many different community contexts that it can be really challenging to anticipate the impacts of our climate action projects. So this is why it's really important to gain an authentic understanding of the variety of communities that we work with, as they're all very, very unique, and the equity approaches to each community would need to be bespoke in order to be effective. All right, next slide, please. So this brings me to our FAR framework, and FAR stands for flexibility, adaptability, and reflexivity. And FAR is kind of an overarching framework that could be applied at any stage of a climate action project. It can definitely be applied within the milestone framework, which I believe will be spoken about more later on. So before I explain the FAR framework in more detail and explain its relationship to EDI, I'll just very quickly read you the definitions of the terms: flexibility, adaptability, and reflexivity, just again so that we're on the same page. But flexibility is the willingness to change in accordance with context, situation, events, or circumstances. Adaptability is similar, but it's the ability to adjust or change in order to suit different contexts, situations, events, or circumstances. And lastly, reflexivity is the process of continual reflection upon the process of a project, action, plan, etc. Reflexivity requires a strong degree of self-awareness, willingness to learn, reflect on one's positionality and take it for granted assumptions, and a commitment to continued engagement with reflection. So just as equity, diversity, and inclusion work together, they have a symbiotic relationship, and we require a balance of all three. Parallel to that, the FAR process works very similarly. So flexibility, adaptability, and reflexivity all work together, and when they're working together and we have them in balance, it's more likely that we're actually able to generate EDI integration within our work. So the main thing that first prompted me actually in developing this FAR framework for the resource goes back to some of those concerns that municipal staff expressed to us directly, some of the concerns that Pacifique was mentioning, but specifically that idea of overwhelm. We don't know where to start. We don't know if what we're doing is working. We're concerned about doing the wrong thing. I feel like thematically overwhelm kind of encapsulated a lot of these concerns. So I really wanted to develop a framework that would speak directly to that concern. And alongside that, I recognize that even though I read you the definitions, equity, diversity, and inclusion are these very broad concepts, these very big ideas. So I also wanted to create a framework that would be able to boil down some of those broad ideas to more actionable items. So flexibility, adaptability, and reflexivity, while they are ideas, they're also concrete actions we can take. And I wanted the framework to be something that could be applied at the more macro project management level, but also something that we could take with us individually in our daily work. And something else that I really like about this framework is not only are these ideas actionable, but they can be used as benchmarks or markers for whether we have actually been cognizant of EDI approaches throughout each step of the project that we've been working on, and even afterwards. So they're really concrete ways for us to check in with ourselves as individuals or on broader scale in terms of a whole group project on whether we actually have been continually bearing in mind those EDI strategies and approaching it in that way. And lastly, I think this is a really strong framework because it is a very real visual representation of what the iterative process of EDI looks like, right? So it shows you in a very concrete sense how and why EDI is an iterative process, what that might look like. And then of course we have within the resource some even further concrete real life examples of how you might apply FAR at each stage of project planning and beyond. All right, next slide, please. So lesson 2 has to do with relationship building and collaboration. So it's closely tied to lesson 1. While lesson 1, we were speaking more to understanding context, understanding community generally, and maybe making those steps towards understanding how to connect initially with communities. This lesson has more to do with when you're actually in collaboration with a diversity of communities. How can you have those collaborations be as effective as possible? How can you build those relationships so that they're really authentic and that you're actually serving the needs of that diversity of communities? And so there are some general ideas here, but again, this is one lesson where I would really direct you to the resource specifically, also because for this particular lesson, we do have links to specific community guidance. So as I said, for lesson 1, because an equitable approach and integrating EDI would look so different and be bespoke community by community, that really will give you a clearer idea of what that might look like for a variety of specific communities in real life. And a lot of those guidance materials have been built through community themselves. So it's really giving you reliable information through direct collaboration about what that might look like, having a strong relationship where you get reliable input on what community needs are. Next slide, please. All right, and lesson 3, our final lesson, we entitled it The Feedback Loop open communication and evolution. And so this lesson, it does speak to literally feedback and how can we get feedback on the process of a project or the impact of a project and ensure that that feedback is genuine and that we're getting as much feedback across a broad spectrum of impacted peoples as possible. And it does speak also to evaluation strategies. So how can we be sure whether the EDI integration strategies that we've utilized have actually worked, that they've actually had the positive impact that we intended? Have they had any sort of unintended consequences? It does speak to all of those things, but I would say more so that this lesson speaks to the evolution of EDI, and again, to EDI integration as an iterative process. So whether that's the way that we're collecting feedback, the type of feedback that we're looking for, or evaluative criteria even, it's not just the strategies that we're implementing that need to undergo evolution, it's also the way that we're understanding and then going back to the table and reimagining those strategies. That entire process needs to constantly be evolving. And so one concept that I think is really helpful in terms of organizations and understanding this, not just the feedback loop, but a tendency for a lot of organizations, is this notion of reactive versus proactive stances. So a reactive stance is tends to be something that's actually common and may feel natural in terms of organizational structures. Reactive stances are often systemically inbuilt in organizations. So it's something that happens very frequently. This kind of stance or reaction is very destination focused and relies on quick results. So when I say destination focused, it's this idea that EDI integration is something that, you know, we can just check off a list, we can do it 100%, and we can do it perfectly. And that's just not the case with EDI, as I've been saying throughout. Again, it's an iterative process. And in the same way that we need to approach different communities with bespoke strategies, a strategy that works at one point in time may not at another point in time. And so we need to be aware of that as well. And so additionally, reactive strategies tend to be kind of knee-jerk reactions. They're very quick. And what we need to be wary of is this kind of stance, a reactive stance, can really cause unsafety from the part of those who are being reactive, so those parties, but also subsequently as a result of that reactive stance for the other parties involved, the organization, or even beyond that, all the parties that are impacted by the work of that organization. So it's really important that we are aware of that. A proactive stance, on the other hand, uses the FAR framework. It's much more process focused, and it has a long-term view in mind, and it acknowledges and responds sensitively as challenges arise, as changes occur. And so I think I'll just make a last point here, and I just want to say that the difference between unsafety and discomfort might seem obvious. So obviously I would advocate for us to use a proactive stance, which can still cause discomfort. And I think that sometimes the embodied feeling of unsafety and discomfort can feel very similar to us. So it can be confusing to differentiate, but we really do need to do a lot of work to separate those things out for ourselves and as organizations, because I think that discomfort occurs as a natural part of the EDI integration process. So whether we're learning new concepts or we're challenging previously held beliefs, or we're reacting to changes within our lives or organizations, discomfort is very natural, and I think that it would be very helpful for us with these processes if we do acknowledge discomfort as a normal part of that process and learn to embrace it to the extent that we can. All right, and I think that going to the next slide, I think I'm out of time. There is one example I had included, but we may not have time to get into that. So again, I would encourage you to take a look at the resource if you want. Yeah.
If we could just go to the example to just sort of briefly go through, we don't have to go through the example in detail, but just outlining what these examples are like in the resource. Just a quick.
Sure. Awesome. If I have time, I'll just read that out to us then. So this is a good example of all the things I've been talking about today. So this is based on a real life example. This municipality recognized the danger that extreme heat posed to the people in their region. They knew that they needed to build cooling stations to service the entire municipality, but they also recognized the challenges posed by making cooling stations accessible to a diversity of people who would require access, and that they also knew that access to cooling stations was particularly important for vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. So what was the solution? What did they decide to do? They decided to allocate funding, staff, and resources to the development and implementation of several cooling stations spread across the region. They also put together a local advisory group, and they really collaborated with community in order to do that. Then the result was that after cooling stations were operational, data was collected over the summer to gauge the efficacy and impact of the cooling stations. And so while it did reduce mortality rates, they also realized that there were some barriers to access, including access to transportation and public stigma surrounding those cooling stations. So they took that information and then went back to the table in order to redesign and improve their strategies to better meet the needs of the community. So I just thought that was a key, great example, and thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you, Natasha. And with that, we'll pass it over to Megan Meany, Executive Director at ICLEI Canada, the partner organization of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, on the Partners for Climate Protection program. So Megan's going to be explaining the linkage between equity, diversity, inclusion, and climate action. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Megan.
Thanks, Angelina. Yeah, we wanted to give some thought to really how EDI can be layered into climate action. Like, we spent a lot of time on fundamentals, which I certainly don't want to dismiss. I think they're fundamentally important. But we wanted to get really more specific in how we might layer these considerations into the milestone framework. So what you're looking at now on this slide is a visual representation of the PCP milestone framework. And Angelina went through it at the very beginning, right? Starting with an inventory, moving to target setting, plan development, implementation, and then monitoring and reporting in a cyclical fashion. We start layering an EDI lens to this, PCP can start to reach beyond our climate mitigation goals towards more goals of just and equitable societies. So I'm going to share our early thinking about how EDI might fit into the framework, but I'd encourage you to also share your examples on how your municipality has started to tackle this in the chat box, and I'll look to those shortly. So first, when we think about creating a baseline inventory, this is in its essence like a data gathering exercise where we look for insights, right? If we start layering EDI into this work, we'll probably start assessing different types of data and start asking different types of questions, like, are greenhouse gas emissions generated evenly across all sectors of society? Is there equitable access to low carbon and affordable energy sources? Is green infrastructure like street trees or open spaces or natural areas, are they equally distributed in our community? Where are the gaps in public transit? And does this correlate to the disadvantaged communities? These types of data and insights, they're really going to help us understand what the pre-existing conditions are and better prepare a climate action plan that can address inequities in society. And then when we start thinking about setting greenhouse gas emission targets, an EDI element that often comes up in the target setting process is the concept of fair share accounting. So this is a term that came from the Paris Agreement, where nations of the world agreed to common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances. So fair share considerations could be brought into municipal and community target setting processes as well. And we can start to ask questions like how has our community gained from a carbon-based economy, and what is our capacity to act in relation to others? Will some sectors of our community take on more responsibility for emission reductions due to their contributions to the emissions profile or due to their capacity to act? These types of considerations will factor EDI into the discussions that often surround the target setting process. And then around the local climate action planning process, this is another opportune time to reconsider how EDI is factored into the municipal planning process and how we engage with equity deserving groups. We can seek to multi-solve, devising plans that not only help to reduce GHG emissions, but also address barriers to equal access to opportunities and resources disadvantaged and discriminated groups face. We can maximize co-benefits while also reducing co-harms and ensuring that measures we put in place don't exacerbate existing inequities or create new ones. In implementing the climate action plan, we have an opportunity to develop more equitable and inclusive society by directing the benefits of our plan implementation towards equity deserving groups and vulnerable groups. This could be by directing climate investments towards under and unemployed, towards lower income neighborhoods, and or by ensuring programs that reduce household cost savings and improve health outcomes accrue to groups with lower socioeconomic status. And then in milestone 5, where we're talking about monitoring and reporting results, this milestone shares a lot in common with milestone 1 in that it includes data gathering and insights. So we can look to the data to learn if our interventions are having the intended impact. Are they heightening inequities in society, or are they helping to address them? Can we change our approach to better address the needs of the community? Milestone 5 is really not the end point of climate action, nor should it be for EDI interventions. It's a moment for reflection, regrouping, and recommitting. So this is just our early stage thinking about how we're starting to incorporate EDI considerations into the milestone framework. We totally recognize we have a lot of learning to do. We have a lot of listening to do. And I hope that this chat box started to get filled with some of the examples you've experienced in doing the same, so we can learn and listen to you. So I'm going to pass it back to Angelina, who's going to move us on to the next page.
Thank you, Megan, for that. It was a really interesting explanation of that intersection, and I definitely second that this is just the beginning of this work. So now we have an interesting opportunity because of the nature of incorporating the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion into climate action work in the municipal context and in organizational context. We're opening it up to have a facilitated discussion with some of the key people who were involved in the creation of this resource and with the key people involved in implementing these concepts in the Federation of Canadian Municipalities organization and ICLEI Canada. So we'll be welcoming back Pacifique Bigiramana, the former PCP fellow, Nikasha Tengrahala, the former PCP fellow, Megan, who just spoke, executive director at ICLEI Canada. We'll also be welcoming Ty Smith, the Senior Director of Anti-Racism, Equity and Inclusion at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and Devin Cosley, Manager at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in Capacity Building, working on the Municipalities for Climate Innovation program. So before we get into the open discussion, I wanted to give Megan, Ty, and Devin an opportunity to introduce the work that their organizations and programs are doing in this space. So I'll be passing it back to Megan, then to Ty, and to Devin. They'll each have 2 minutes to provide an explanation of how they're moving this important work forward. So I'll pass it back to Megan.
Thanks, Angelina. So I think many of you know that ICLEI is a global organization of local governments that are committed to sustainability. And what you're looking at here is the 5 interconnected pathways that guide ICLEI's work. And these were developed by our membership and by our governance structure. So we've got low emissions development, nature-based development, equitable and people-centered development, resilient development, and circular development. And if you ever see ICLEI active, it's generally under one of these categories. But of course, EDI considerations cross all pathways, but we find that it's really grounded in what we call that equitable and people-centered development pathway. This pathway, it works to build just, livable, happy, and inclusive urban communities that address the systematic causes of poverty and inequality and safeguards natural systems to support human life. It's ICLEI's newest pathway, and the flagship initiative coming out of this pathway is called the Malmo Commitment. This encourages sustainable approaches, innovation, adaptability, participation, and inclusiveness in policymaking to tackle the current climate emergency by embedding social equity at the core of local sustainable development. It gathers local governments that commit to this urban transformation following a 4-step process, which I won't get into right now because we don't have enough time. But the reason it's called the Malmo Commitment is, one, because it was launched at our World Congress, hosted by the city of Malmo in May, but also because Malmo takes this type of sustainability very seriously. They are one of the first municipality, well, they are the first municipality in Sweden and one of the first in the world to commit to the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they really strive to be socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable. So they and ICLEI are working with a pilot group of 8 cities as early adopters to this Malmo commitment. And together they're collaborating with community stakeholders to identify those key sustainability challenges that have to be prioritized. They're designing social equity indicators to measure and monitor progress, they're reporting against those, and they're engaging the broader neighborhood communities in this process. So that's kind of at the global level, how ICLEI is prioritizing EDI. But at the national level, at ICLEI Canada, I would say we can summarize our work in EDI in 3 ways. One is this EDI resource that we're talking about here today. And we're really working now to determine how to incorporate EDI more strongly into the PCP milestone framework. So that's 1. 2 is the focus of our annual event called the Livable Cities Forum. The theme of this year's event is Conversations for an Inclusive Future. And it's actually happening really soon, October 3rd to 5th in Victoria. So we encourage you to come out. And here we're really looking at what lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change coming together. We're going to look at important synergies between the efforts to address social vulnerabilities exposed through the pandemic and efforts to increase climate resilience and achieve net zero communities across Canada through that equity lens. And third and final is we're also in the process of creating another resource centered on equity and local government climate adaptation. Many of you know that ICLEI also runs a climate adaptation program called BARC, or Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities. So this resource is intended to address barriers preventing local governments from taking action to support climate change adaptation in a way that centers equity and community engagement. So that resource will be coming out within the coming months, and you can stay tuned for that. So that's our kind of international and national approach to EDI for now, and I'll hand it back over to Angelina.
Thank you, Megan. And I'll hand it to Ty to explain the Federation of Canadian Municipalities action.
Hi, good day, everyone. Bonjour. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. As you just heard, my name is Ty Smith. I'm going to use the pronouns he, him, his, and il. So at FCM, we are, my unit is brand new for the organization, but the work is not. It had been occurring in piece parts, mainly through the programs for quite some time. And FCM, like many other organizations, sought to then take a more intentional approach to this work. And we recognize equity as fairness achieved through systematically assessing disparities in opportunities and outcomes caused by structures and systems, which are then addressed through meaningful inclusion of and representation of affected communities and individuals, taking targeted action, and of course, changing institutional structures and systems to remove barriers and increase pathways to participation and positive outcomes. And so to that end, we are taking a systems-based approach to anti-racism, equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. And you'll see this little graph here on the slide. By a systems-based approach, that means everything is on the table. We take a look at policy, practices, and our resource flows. You can tell an organization's commitment by where they allocate their money and their human resources. It's also about taking a look at our relationships and our connections. So with whom should we be partnering? Who is out there in the landscape that might be in alignment with some of what we seek to do and achieve? And how can we form particular relationships? It's also about taking a look at power dynamics. Who holds power in what circumstance and in what way? And how might that be distributed in order to really foster equity? And lastly, but most importantly, is the mental models, really looking at that transformative change through the changing of mindsets, which requires more than a one-off training or webinar, but really shifting one's mindset. So for example, earlier, Pacifique was talking about some people saying, we already have a lot of work to do. We don't have the space and time to add this to our work. Well, the shift in mindset would be the recognition that this is your work. This is not on top of your work, it is your work. That if you're really looking to meet the needs and the priorities of a range of communities within your municipalities, then applying an anti-racism, equity, and inclusion and reconciliation framework, principles and practices are inherently part of the work, not on top of it. And so it's really, really important. I say deploy it as you speak.
It's referring to the poll at the end. Don't worry, Ty.
Oh, okay, right. I'm seeing the questions coming up as I'm speaking.
Yeah.
So this is the framework that we're taking at FCM. So that's taking a look at our own policies, our own practices, our resource flows, our relationships, our power dynamics, and shifting our mental models in order to create the conditions for success and participation of all. Next slide. And so when it comes to the approach for this particular work, we are looking at cultivating internal champions as well as external champions. We're looking at providing training, and that's ongoing training and development opportunities to build skills and knowledge, and to go from intellectual knowledge to embodied knowledge, where you're moving from I kind of know to I really know, and that you're really almost effortlessly applying. To create mandates and directives. So currently we are in the process of developing our anti-racism, equity, and inclusion strategy. It'll be a nice umbrella for a range of equity issues. We're looking at identifying multiple entry points for this work. So strategically taking a look at what we do and where can we embed the principles and practices strategically for a bigger bang for our buck. Also seeking support from all levels of the organization, demonstrating our results over time. And that means we also have to identify our indicators of success. And again, going back to Pacifique's presentation, we don't know if we're hitting the mark, speaks to the fact that in the planning process, there wasn't that indicator of, well, what are our desired outcomes? And then what would be those indicators of those desired outcomes so that you are tracking and monitoring them throughout, and then you're better able to tell your story in terms of process and outcomes, as well as be able to pivot where needed. And of course, we want to celebrate our successes. We want to ensure sustainability in the work by embedding it within the work. And then to communicate throughout an organization, and of course, engage communities in the work. And this goes back to relationships and partnerships and really thinking about how we do what we do. So in terms of the way forward for FCM, we're looking at our board just recently approved our anti-racism and equity statement that really makes a clear commitment to anti-racism, equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. But it doesn't just state a commitment, but also talks about what this means to FCM. Then we're looking at the development of relevant policies within the organization. And then, of course, we have the framework and the strategy. And as I mentioned, it's a bit of an umbrella that will serve reconciliation, gender, accessibility, bilingualism, and anti-racism as our strategy. And so I don't know if I have another slide there. Do I, in terms of the structure for the work? So in terms of getting this work done, within my unit, you currently have me as the senior director. We have the equity and inclusion advisor, Imrana. We're currently hiring for the research and evaluation lead, and we have a posting out there for a reconciliation lead to be able to guide this work, all of which is supported by a task force that we have internally made up of representation from across the organization. So as we have particular ideas, they can kind of filter it through and give us some key considerations, talking about how it might work or land for specific teams. And when it comes to getting some of this work done, we're developing ad hoc working groups so that people who might want to be, might want to participate in the work, but don't have the time to sit on a standing committee like the task force, but would be more willing and able to participate on a really focused working group where you have a particular project. And then we're also eventually going to be launching a champion program so that within each team or unit, we'll identify a champion who will we will provide education and training, and that person will represent anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, and reconciliation in their own area. So really being that person to help drive and ensure the work. And one of the key pieces to this is an equity lens. So one of the resources that we're developing within the organization is an equity lens. If you don't already have one, I strongly encourage you to do so and make it a part of your process. Planning, implementation, and evaluation. Asking yourself if it's a project, an event, whatever the proposal on the table, if there's a point of decision making, you need to ask who's around the table. Who will be impacted by this particular proposal, whether it's an event, a resource, any kind of decision point. You know, does it align with our principles around anti-racism, equity, and inclusion and reconciliation? Who's impacted and in what way? And then engaging those voices. So doing your due diligence around research, engaging impacted communities, as you've heard throughout, and really creating those pathways for meaningful participation. And then thinking about how will you know? So you're going to develop strategies accordingly. And then, of course, you want to identify those indicators that you will then track and monitor to determine to what degree are you hitting the mark as set out in your planning process. And so that is part of what we're doing at FCM. Right now, we're focused on building our internal capacity. And this is really key. Before you just implement it programmatically, you really want to ensure that your organization has the capacity. So you want to start at home and taking a look at your own policies, your procedures, your organizational culture, and really, really thinking it through in a wholehearted way, engaging communities meaningfully in looking at your organization. And of course, it can't be perfectly linear, as I would love it to be. We know that our programs are happening. And so you want to apply this lens to your programs, but you're doing this work in your organization to build a common and shared language and understanding of this work and the skills, and not just the skills in doing this work, but the confidence. Confidence is often a barrier to people doing this work in a sustained way. And so you really want to pay attention to building not only knowledge and skills, but confidence as well. And knowing that mistakes happen. And people rather that you try and make a mistake versus not trying at all. And so I think I'll stop there in terms of what you can do moving forward. But that's a little bit about what we're doing here at FCM. And this particular project is a part of that, piece in terms of providing some supports to municipalities in building your skills and knowledge and confidence in doing this work.
Thank you, Ty. So if we could share the screen of all the panelists, I'm going to let Devin introduce himself because we did go a bit long there. So I'm going to cut my wrap up to make it a tad shorter. So Kiana, if you could stop sharing the screen and pin Ty, Devin, myself, Megan, Nikasha, and Pacifique, that would be great. And Devin, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Angelina, and hello, everybody. Yeah, we always run out of time. This is such a great conversation and great perspectives from Megan and Ty on those last sections. Yeah, I'm coming in, I guess, a bit from the ecosystem-wide perspective on climate and a bit on the EDI as we're seeing it with other organizations and partners we work with. Through the Municipalities for Climate Innovation program, which has been the $75 million sort of capacity development program for communities on climate change since 2016. And just wrapping up now, we've really worked across the ecosystem. So trying to be that enabler, working with networks, working with partners, trying to embed staff resources in municipalities along with the plans and studies, so that institutional change and ecosystem sort of collaborator in that space. And in that time, we can say there's been a real acceleration of this discussion, and from discussion into action in those 5-6 years. There, I can say I first really came to light with this topic when I was invited to be part of the City of Toronto's Transform TO action plan back in 2017, where it really rose up with questions about who is benefiting from the projects they were identifying in their plan. If you're going to put electric vehicle charging stations in homes and subsidize them, well, who's buying the electric vehicles? It's probably not low-income people, not recent immigrants. So who's benefiting from what projects, asking those questions and getting that thinking going. Since then, many funders, many foundations, many organizations doing capacity building are asking questions about EDI and the programs they offer, the funding they offer. So as municipalities, you're thinking of this in your plans and projects, some of the funding streams you're going to start looking to are going to be asking these questions as well. Who have you engaged? How are you representative of your communities, the diversity? Have you looked at a lens of who is impacting, who's benefited? Unfortunately, when MSIP was created, this conversation was just getting going, so it wasn't core to our program design, but we have been able to fund a number of communities who have looked at this on the ground. The City of Vancouver is a great example, and there's a case study I can post in here afterwards. But we're going to see this wave of momentum keep going. I think from when the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations were released, 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement, the death of George Floyd, and a number of other things in the last couple of years. We're building a wave here, and this conversation is just getting started in how to make this into practice with communities and institutions.
Thank you, Devin. So unfortunately, we have to cut the discussion much shorter than anticipated because everyone had so much richness in their organizational context. Some of the questions that we were going to ask was respect to municipalities' direct experience with integrating these concepts. So as Megan and Ty and Devin all explained, there's been a lot of operational work. So how have your municipalities begun to operationalize some of these concepts? If you have any questions about getting started, please, I encourage you to put them in the chat, and I will circulate them to the panelists so that we can get some sort of response. In terms of timing, I'm going to have my colleague launch the poll, but in the interim, I want to invite Megan to share a bit more about the work with municipalities, integrating the concepts of equity, diversity, inclusion, and what your experience has been.
I think what Devin said earlier, I really think resonated with many municipalities that are in the climate planning process, is that once they started to see the climate mitigation actions that they were implementing, whether they be like building retrofits or EV vehicles, that really started to become very apparent that the affluent were the people that were affording these things, and they were not taking a very community-focused approach to their climate planning process. So I think that was a real awakening. I also think the pandemic was a real awakening. People really started, I found people really started to understand, okay, this is a pandemic. It's not all that different from all the climate impacts we always hear about, and look at the impact it's having on some populations over others. And so I think that gave people a much more common kind of understanding. And then I think gone are the days where we think climate planning is a linear process that we're going to start and finish. Like, many municipalities are on their second or third generation of these climate plans. We now understand that it's iterative, that we need to come back and revisit this, that it's circular. And I think there's a longer term commitment being made now with climate plans, is that, you know, this isn't a once and done thing. We're going to be revisiting, and obviously the sense of urgency is ramping up. But I think there's a deeper understanding of the nature of the planning process being iterative and founded in a sense of continuous improvement.
Thank you, Megan. And since we have 3 minutes, I want to give 30 seconds to Tyler, Pacific, and Nikasha to each share your thoughts on that question on the operationalization. Sorry, I'm having trouble with that word. So I'll pass it to Pacific, and then Ty, and then Nikasha. Allons-y, Pacific.
Comme approche d'opérationnaliser
An operational approach for the EDI processes, as we said, the first thing that needs to be done is to, first of all, identify the problems, identify what types of actions we can put in place locally. After that, when we then move to the activity, climate action, for example, in a community or in a municipality, we then have to identify the stakeholders. So it's players and stakeholders who will participate, and then take into consideration all vulnerabilities, because vulnerabilities are variable, like I mentioned. There are vulnerabilities connected with the socioeconomic status, and we also look at geographical position, and there are a number of vulnerabilities. Once we understood what vulnerabilities we are facing, well, at that point, we have to invite everyone in an inclusive process to plan. And in terms of planning, we have to establish criteria that are inclusive criteria for decision making, and make sure that it, I'm sorry? I do have to turn the floor over to Ty because we are quickly running out of time. Yes, no problem, I understand.
I think it's a mistake to hand it over to me, who's incredibly verbose. But what I'll say in terms of operationalization is essentially what I said in my presentation. I think it's really important to have an equity lens, and it becomes standard practice to be used by everyone for every key decision, whether it's an event, resource development, a program, whatever it might be, that there are a set of strategic questions that are asked and answered in order to surface any assumptions and gaps and negative impacts of the work. But in order for people to really use the lens and to understand the work, there needs to be that building of capacity internally for buy-in. People need to understand what these terms mean and how to apply them.
Perfect. And Nikasha, your thoughts?
Gosh, I'll try and keep this as quick as possible. I think that, you know, there are simultaneous levels of change that need to be occurring. So I can understand that there's this sense of urgency, like how do we apply this stuff now, and, you know, how can we get started with this, which makes sense. But there is institutional, cultural, and individual change that are all kind of moving pieces at the same time that really need to be working together in order to take that first step forward collectively. Those all need to be in sync. So that would be my takeaway thought.
Perfect. And we ended at 2:30. I would have loved to give the floor back to Megan and Devin and hear more from all the panelists, but thank you very much, participants, for coming. And this is just the first of many of these webinars and opportunities we'll have for discussion. So I really appreciate it. Because this is a Zoom webinar, we will be ending the room, and once we end it, everyone will be sent off. So if we'll give everyone a few seconds to put their last remaining comments in the chat. I'd like to thank everyone who was a panelist.